The moment of world history that we find ourselves in right now can be described as a perfect storm. This moment has seen, the last 3 years in particular, has seen a convergence of a range of different crises. We first had the fuel price crisis that had a knock-on effect with the food price crisis. And for the record, even though fuel prices came down, food prices did not come down proportionally. We have an ongoing poverty crisis that takes the lives of 50,000 men, women, and children every single day, a large number of those in Africa. If you were wanting to contextualize what the poverty crisis means in a global narrative, that's the equivalent of about 5 9/11s every single day. The climate crisis has also been with us now for some time. And then we had the financial crisis, which then got those with power to stand up and say, we need to do something. However, one of the sad realities is that the response of governments has largely been to actually address the crisis we find ourselves in using the same tools of thinking and mechanisms that actually got us in the crisis in the first place. There are many troubling questions that now must be asked when we think about all of these crises coming together and how does civil society and progressive governments actually respond to the crisis. When we look at the political will shown 2 years ago, when governments were able to mobilize not millions, not billions, but trillions of dollars to bail out the banks, the bankers, and the bonuses, when we do not actually see a fraction of that political will on the parts of the most powerful governments in the world. Secondly, it's important to just pause for a moment to just flip things around. Had those bailouts and so on the trillions of dollars happened by developing country governments to bail out their banks, you would have had a whole UN cry on the part of the Western governments saying that this was interfering with the free market, this was not, that they would have then called it socialism and communism and so on. So it's very important that we understand part of what this period of history we are in is teaching us very, very clearly, if we had not yet learned, that there is a fundamental double standards in the way rich and poor countries are expected to perform at the global level. Some of you might remember that in the early 1990s, there was a slogan that said, think globally, act locally. What was behind this slogan was irrespective of the issues that one was trying to address at the national or local level, we needed to better understand how global institutions, global discourse, and global processes created the possibilities or lack thereof of what we could or could not achieve at the local or national level. However, one of the ironies of the moment of history that we find ourselves in, precisely when countries like our own South Africa were getting formal electoral democracy for the first time, real power was shifting from the national to the global levels. So today you cannot address the issue of environmental destruction solely as a national issue. You cannot address the issue of trade and being able to actually a democratic economic framework for individual countries other than fighting those struggles at the global level. Even when we look at H1N1 virus, avian flu, bird flu, and so on, these crises do not respect borders. When we look at the crisis of HIV/AIDS in South Africa, for example, while a lot of responsibility for our lack of action must rest with government because of the dithering around the science of HIV/AIDS, but you cannot even solve HIV solely as a national issue because the pricing of life-saving pharmaceutical drugs is happening at a global level. So it was not surprising then in the early 1990s, people began to question, hang on a minute, if real power shifting from the national to the global levels around trade, around environment, around economy, around finance, currency management, and so on. And if we think globally and act solely locally, then we will be removing ourselves increasingly from where real power resides. So it's for that reason today, the choice of people living in developing countries, both government and business, government and civil society have to actually be to think globally and locally and act both locally and globally if indeed for some of the issues where we need progress, power resides with institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and so on. So to link up with Patrick's presentation, I want to look at the climate crisis quickly, and it is therefore not surprising that much of civil society last year put huge effort on trying to get an appropriate climate treaty from the United Nations framework on climate change. Much of civil society went to Copenhagen with the view of trying to secure what some called a FAB treaty. By FAB, we didn't mean fabulous, but we meant fair, ambitious, and binding treaty. Let me just walk you through those words quickly. Fair, we wanted a treaty that actually would recognize that people in developing countries have been least responsible for the climate chaos we find ourselves in, and therefore should be compensated for the climate impacts that are happening already, as well as to be supported with the resources to be able to adapt to climate change and for them not to have to follow the same dirty energy path that was actually pursued by rich countries to reach their level of development. And the specific demand there was we wanted rich countries to commit to $140 billion a year for mitigation and adaptation for developing countries. Now, 140 billion might have sounded like a huge amount of money a couple of years back, but when we saw the kind of political will shown by politicians to raise the kind of money to bail out the very people that got us in the mess in the first place as a result of the financial crisis and the conduct of banks, then we realized that actually $140 billion is actually small change in the context of global finance. The ambition, why we wanted an ambitious agreement, was because we don't want governments to simply be taking baby steps in the right direction. We want a level of ambition that should be equal to what the science is actually telling us we need to do. And the science is saying that we have to cut emissions by 25 to 40% by 2020 on the part of rich countries. We have to try to look by 2015 at 80% reductions. And sadly, when we went to Copenhagen, the developed countries did not actually come with the kind of ambitious emissions cuts that would give confidence to developing countries that they can also move in a direction to actually support that. Why binding? History teaches us that when the United Nations, as these various summits as they do, and if you look at the World Summit on Sustainable Development that Patrick referred to in 2002 in South Africa, and then you look at how high the level of compliance was with the decisions taken at these US summits, you will find that in fact the level of compliance and implementation would be less than 20% if you're lucky. If you can hit 20% compliance, then you've made good progress. So in that sense, given the urgency of the situation we find ourselves, we wanted to actually ensure that we get a binding treaty. Sadly, instead of getting a FAB treaty, we ended up with a FLAB treaty, F-L-A-B, which stands for full of loopholes and bullshit. And essentially, there was a lot of spin in terms of how different countries presented their targets. For example, Barack Obama presented an emission cut target of 17% by 2020, but when you look closer at the detail, they are talking about actually from 1990 levels, which is what the science says we should measure from, if the effect of that emissions cut was less than 4%. So that is why the tensions between India and China, Brazil, the African bloc, for example, was extremely challenging because they were very, very far apart in terms of targets. So in this current context then, what do we do in terms of how we move forward? Now, importantly, after Copenhagen, the Copenhagen conference is known as the Conference of the Parties. It happens annually since Rio in 1992. This year it goes to Cancun. And at Cancun, we will continue to keep the pressure on pushing for a fair, ambitious, and binding treaty. And just parenthetically, I should say, after Cancun, the next Conference of the Parties takes place actually in South Africa. So while we continue to put pressure on getting a global deal, we also have to now put pressure to try to ensure how we get actually national progress to ensure that governments are doing the right thing to actually push hard to actually secure reduction so that we can secure this planet for our children and grandchildren. Let's be very, very clear here. It is not as if the impacts of climate change are yet to have impact. According to Kofi Annan's Global Humanitarian Forum, last year 300,000 people lost their lives directly from climate impacts. If we look at an issue such as the genocide in Darfur, for example, yes, it's true that there is an ethnic dimension to it, but I would argue that the biggest driver of that conflict is a result of water scarcity and land scarcity that was actually brought about by climatic impacts. Lake Chad, one of the largest inland seas that neighbors Darfur, is virtually dry today as a result of climatic impacts. So when we see it in that context, this is an issue of justice. That is why we talk about climate justice. And if you want to put it in our context in South Africa, we used to talk about apartheid as we understood it. For years now, we've been talking about global economic apartheid, and increasingly, when we look at the color of the skin of those that are paying the first and most brutal price and who are in the front line of climatic impacts, clearly it is those from developing countries, and that is why we increasingly use the terminology of climate apartheid as well. So why is activism against climate change so challenging? There are three particular challenges. First, unlike human rights or poverty, anti-poverty activism, where you can point a camera at people living in poverty or somebody who's got torture marks on their body, and people can understand much more quickly the injustice and hopefully respond to it. With climate change, it's a slow burning accumulated impact, and it's really difficult to point to something and say that is climate change. The second problem is the issue of the science at two levels. Thankfully, what we are saying in terms of the denialism of the science, I see a déjà vu here. I have a sense of déjà vu because I feel we're at the same moment on the climate science as we were on the HIV/AIDS science, if you want, where we are seeing the last kicks of the denialist os. However, it's important to recognize that activists also have started to talk in a language that increasingly few people can understand. When you say, for example, we need to ensure that there's no more than 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, when we talk about 1 degree, 1.5 degree, 2 degrees maximum temperature rise that we can actually afford, when we talk about percentage cuts and so on, what we find is that the whole conversation becomes alienating for the very people that we need to bring into the struggle to push change. So one of our challenges on the activist side is also to learn to speak in a more accessible, non-jargonistic way. The third and most important challenge that we face, however, is with climate change, activism comes up against the most organized, most strategic, most effective corporate lobby that we have ever seen historically and presently. I jokingly say sometimes that, you know, if you want to understand President Bush, both George Bush Sr. as well as his dad, they were effectively secondees of the fossil fuel industry into the White House. When we look at the kinds of money that are being used to promote climate science and so on, we've got a huge challenge there. But notwithstanding all of this, we have to now challenge ourselves as those of us that are pushing for change if we are saying to governments and business that it cannot be business as usual, then we in civil society also have to say that it cannot be activism as usual. We need to recognize that what is at stake here is life on this planet, our children and grandchildren's future, that this is not like any other challenge. This is a convergence of challenges that is taking lives on a significant level already, and therefore it requires a more strategic, a more courageous and a more passionate response. So let me just conclude quickly by then just saying what I think we need to do differently. One is the fact that developing countries, certain developing countries, South Africa included, part of the basic group of countries, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, have to use their newfound space that they have secured at the level of the UN negotiations, not to behave in the same way as developed countries behaved, where they marginalize the smaller and weaker countries. The challenge for the basics countries, including South Africa, is not to forget the rest of Africa and the rest of the developing world that do not actually have a voice in these negotiations. Secondly, we need to be more strategic about thinking about new allies and taking risks. For example, I've enjoyed very much starting some speeches recently by saying, I agree with the CIA and the Pentagon. Now that's a sentence that I never thought I would start any speech with, that in fact climate change constitutes one of the biggest security challenges in the future, and therefore we need to act with greater urgency. We need to look at putting pressure on businesses who are climate criminals, who are engaged in activities that are actually devastating the planet. And I believe that big corporations, and if I look at my experience here at Greenpeace in the last 6 months, I can see that they are very vulnerable for the right kind of activism. In passing, I should say that I've attended the World Economic Forum on previous occasions in my previous role. I attended this year for the first time as Greenpeace. And this year I was amazed that many CEOs of big companies were wanting to meet with me. And I was querying this, and my colleagues were saying, well, you know, the folks in the business community realize if that they don't try to get organizations like Greenpeace to the table, they will be on our menu. So, our approach as Greenpeace is to ensure that we have a multi-pronged approach, keeping the pressure on the formal negotiations at the UN, but also continuing to keep pressure at the level of corporations, national governments, and so on, where we need to get progress. Let me just conclude then by saying that for Africa, in this crisis, there is some opportunity. Africa has the largest potential in solar energy. It has significant potential in wave energy, wind energy, biomass, geothermal, and so on. And I would argue that we have not begun to even tap continentally even 5% of the renewable energy possibilities that we have. So moving forward, we have to work out how do we address all of these crises in a much more integrated way than we've done in the past, and how do we actually ensure that we're turning, in part, this crisis into opportunity. We can generate millions of new, clean, renewable, decent jobs if we moved away from our fossil fuel addiction, leave the coal in the hole and leave the oil in the soil, or whatever the slogans might be. We have to be looking at how can we generate new, clean ways, and the knowledge is there, the political will isn't. So let me conclude with a small story from Durban. When I was 22 years old, I was fleeing into exile, and my best friend, Kumi Naidoo, asked me a question. He said, what's the biggest contribution you can make to the cause of humanity? I was 22 years old at that time, didn't Lenny was a very philosophical guy. So I said, well, you know, giving your life. He said, you mean participating in a demonstration, getting shot and killed? I said, I guess so. And he said, that's a wrong answer. It's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. 2 years later, while I was in exile, I got a call from home telling me that my friend Lenny and 3 young women from Umlazi and Kwamashu in Lamontville were brutally murdered by Eugene de Kock and the 3rd Force Flak Plus unit. I had to think deeply about what he was actually saying. What he was saying was the struggle for justice, the struggle for democracy, the struggle to eradicate poverty. These struggles are marathons, they're not sprints. So those of us who have the capability, like every one of us who are participating in this conference today, need to recognize that the biggest contribution we can make is a lifetime of commitment until these injustices are eradicated from our planet. But to complicate matters, as Al Gore put it when he received his Nobel Peace Prize, evoking an African proverb, he said, there's a proverb that says that if you want to go far, go together. If you're going to go quickly, go alone. The challenge, my dear brothers and sisters, I believe right now, is not that we have time for a full marathon. Maybe a half a marathon is stops. But importantly, we have to learn to move fast, quickly, because time is running out. And if we do not rise to the challenge as academics, as civil society activists, as progressive people in government and business, if we do not step forward and actually take a stand, history will judge us extremely harshly. So I'd like to invite all of you to find ways, if you're not already involved, to actually get involved in the struggle for global justice, and specifically to learn more and to get involved to ensure that we can avert catastrophic climate change, which will exacerbate poverty in Africa and all over the world. Thank you very much.